Shalom, it's Izzy here with Holy Language Institute at holylanguage.com. I wanted to show you an interesting passage in Hebrew that I believe sheds some light on the words of Jesus about the end of the world. Remember, of course, that Jesus was Jewish, which means that Jesus is Jewish because, if you believe the scriptures, it says, Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever, which is really neat to think about, that Christ, it's not just that he was a Jewish rabbi, but he is a Jewish rabbi. And there's a Jewish rabbi coming back to rule the world. Wow. And anyways, that's something really neat to think about. And you have to remember that Jesus read the Bible in Hebrew, and he prayed the traditional Jewish prayers in Hebrew. Sometimes people say, well, what was the original language of Jesus? Was it Hebrew or Aramaic? The answer is yes. They were both living languages spoken in the Second Temple era, and they were mixed up to some degree also. And this is the Bible that Jesus read. So I want to show you something from the Bible that Jesus read, because the Hebrew Bible is the context of the words of Christ. You got to remember, like I said, these guys read the Bible in Hebrew, and it was like their theological word book and dictionary, so to speak. So I want to show you an interesting passage here. It's actually the Hebrew word to embalm. Here we have Esord, we have Genesis chapter 50. Really, it's a very rarely used word. In fact, the only place it's used is in this story of the embalming of Jacob, except for one other place, which we're going to look at because that's where things get interesting. Right. So here we have the English text. I'm going to show you the Hebrew text here also. Right here. All right. So this is Genesis chapter 50 in Hebrew. And we just finished doing a Hebrew verses lesson where we read through this entire chapter word by word and prayed together and just let it be a beautiful experience of relating to God through his holy language. And so I want to show you the Hebrew word here for to embalm. So here it says la chanot. So the verb to embalm is chanat right there. And that's the verb. Now let's go back to the English here. Where are you, Esord? Here you are. And I'm going to show you a really neat feature of Esord. Maybe you've seen this before. Okay, so I have a bunch of the translations and paraphrases that I consult loaded in my version of Esord. This is a great software. It's free. Anybody can get it and use it. And you can see here that there's the plus version, which shows you the Strong's numbers. So here are the Strong's numbers. And you can see here the word to embalm. It's Strong's number 2590. So what we're going to do is we're going to right click on this word. We're going to do a quick search, and it's going to show us everywhere that this word is used in the Bible and how it's translated. And this is where things get interesting. Now, as you can see, it's used twice, as we already said, in this story. Firstly, in reference to the embalming of Jacob, and which is interesting because this is Israel, like the patriarch of the nation. It's interesting that he actually he was embalmed in accordance with the Egyptian burial custom. And then secondly, in the embalming of Joseph at the end of the chapter in the book of Genesis. Now, did you notice something? Like, this is kind of, it almost feels kind of morbid, talking about burial customs and embalming. The only other place it's used is in this beautiful Song of Songs, the poetic love song. And let's go there and have a look at this. Why is this word used in the Song of Songs? Here it is. It's used in this passage right here. The fig tree has ripened its figs. So the word here for figs ripening is the same Hebrew word for embalming a corpse. What's with that? Now, this is where things get really interesting, because when Yeshua of Nazareth was talking about the end of the age, he used this mashal, which is the Hebrew word for like a parable or an analogy. And I want to go there with you now, and then we're going to track back to this rare Hebrew word and how it's puzzlingly used in reference to embalming a dead body, and then the fig tree putting forth its figs in this fashion. All right, so let's go there together. Matthew chapter 24. All right, now you can see here in verse, let's look at the context of this chapter. So Yeshua's disciples, they come to him privately, and they say, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age. Okay, I really want you to notice this phrase here, end of the age, because we're actually going to look at two instances of Hebrew wordplay in the words of the Master. Now, you might be saying, wait a minute, Izzy, wait a minute. No, no, no. The New Testament was originally written in Greek. Matthew was written in Greek. So what's all this Hebrew business? All right. And there's a question amongst scholars about what the original language of the New Testament was. And you really have to go on a book-by-book basis, because pretty much all the early church fathers were agreed that Matthew wrote his gospel in Hebrew, which makes sense. I mean, Hebrew is the language of the Jewish people. Matthew was a traditional Jew. He was writing his book to traditional Jews. It makes sense. All right. So here's the interesting question. What were the original words of Yeshua in Hebrew and or Aramaic? Something to remember is that Yeshua frequently quoted the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures. He grew up steeped in the Hebrew Bible, as did his disciples, of course. And for instance, he quoted it. He fasted for 40 days. He probably felt like totally brain dead by then. I know I would. And yet at the same time, when he's experiencing these horrible temptations, he's still able to quote the Torah by memory right there and then. He did that several times. So obviously he knew his stuff when it came to the Hebrew scriptures. It's interesting that quoting the Torah was spiritual warfare for the Master. Makes me wonder if that might be a very valid and a potent form of spiritual warfare for us also. So anyways, that's the background of the Gospels. You have to understand that regardless of what language the New Testament was written in, the Hebrew Bible is the context of the New Testament. So that's a Jewish context. That's why I'm really passionate about helping people to read the Bible in Hebrew and helping them to read the New Testament in that original Jewish context and get to know Jesus better in his original Jewish context also. Because that wasn't just something like from the past. Like that's present and future also. Because that's who he is, as I already said. So anyways, let's read the words of the Master here in that original Jewish context. Now, I want to point out one thing specifically to you here. I personally believe that the disciples of Yeshua are going to go through all the stuff he talked about here, the Great Tribulation. And I believe that because if you read Matthew 24, he talks to them like they're going to be there to see it. And he also uses the word then. He talks about the Great Tribulation, and he talks about how then the angels are going to be sent to gather his chosen from the four corners. Anyways, read it for yourself, see what you think, but really, ask yourself those two questions. What's the chronology that he's giving here? And is he talking to them like they're going to be there to see this stuff or not? So anyways, just as a side note, I would encourage you to read Matthew 24 for yourself and ask yourself those two questions. Now, like for instance right here, 24:29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, these things are going to happen, and he's going to what? He's going to send forth his angels and gather together his chosen. Notice he said after the tribulation of those days. It's interesting. Okay, anyways, he goes on to say, now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Now, there are two possible instances of Hebrew wordplay in the words of the Master here. Firstly, the Hebrew word for end is kates. Remember they asked, what's the sign of the kates? The end of the age? All right, so the Hebrew phrase there for like the end of the age or the end of the world is kates ha'olam. And it's just spelled with the Hebrew letters kuf tzadi. All right, now guess what the Hebrew word for summer is? Kaitz. Kaitz. Pronounced almost the same and spelled almost the same. Summer is spelled kuf yod tzadi instead of just kuf tzadi. Right? So these words are related. The Hebrew word for end and the Hebrew word for summer are related. The end of the world is the kates ha'olam. The summer is the kites. So can you see here how he's drawing this parallel between right before summer, the kites, and right before the kates, the end of the world. All right. So there could be some Hebrew wordplay in the original words of the Master. We can't say for sure, but it could be. And then secondly, notice how he talks about the fig tree, and he uses this phrase about its branch becoming tender and putting forth its leaves. Now, what was he talking about? Like, what passage in the Hebrew Bible was he referencing? My suspicion, and we can't say for sure, but this is my suspicion, is that he was referencing this Hebrew verb chanat. which is used in Shir Hashirim, in the Song of Songs, and is also used in the story of the embalming of Israel and Joseph in Genesis chapter 50. All right, so that's the big idea there, and let's just think about this and unpack it together a little bit. Okay, there's the possibility that Genesis chapter 50, Song of Songs chapter 2, and Matthew chapter 24 are connected. All right, so Genesis chapter 50, the story of the embalming of Jacob and then Joseph. Song of Songs chapter 2, let's look at that in just a moment. We're going to look at the meaning of it. And then Matthew 24, the end of the world, and the things that are going to happen directly prior to that. Now, are these connected? Could they be connected somehow? And that's what we're going to look at here. All right. Now, my suspicion is that Yeshua used this language, and when he was talking about the parable of the fig tree, his disciples thought back to Song of Songs chapter 2. What does it say? It's really interesting. It's this beautiful love song. It's the boy talking to the girl here. And he says, a couple of verses before, he says, "Arise, my darling, my beautiful, and come along, for behold, the winter is past." Guess what season that was? Spring, the beginning of summer. All right, can you see the parallel right there between this chapter and Yeshua's words in Matthew chapter 24? He said, "Summer is near." All right, so we have a parallel there. He goes on to say, it's a beautiful description of that season. The fig tree has ripened its figs. "Arise, my darling, my beautiful one, and come along." All right, so what would that mean to Yeshua's disciples? He's talking about the most horrible time that the planet will ever experience. Yeshua said if those days weren't cut short, whatever that means, nobody would survive. There would be no life left on planet Earth. It's going to be really bad. And then, at the same time, he references Song of Songs chapter 2. He gives this veiled allusion to this passage with the lover saying to his beloved, "Winter's over, and the rains are gone. The flowers are coming out. It's the beginning of a beautiful season. The fig tree has ripened its figs." There's that phrase. So, can you hear possibly some encouragement from the Master? He was saying, even when you go through the worst times this world has ever known, even when you experience intense pressure and great tribulation in your life, I am your lover. And there is going to be an end to the season. And I'm going to come for you. And it's going to be beautiful. So let's go together. Come along with me. You are my darling. You are my beloved one. Those words of love, those words of encouragement and affirmation from the Master. And you may also be wondering, okay, what's the connection between, the fig tree ripening its figs and then, a corpse being embalmed? That sounds kind of weird. Well, in a way, like when someone dies, it's like their body has fully ripened, and maybe there's a connection there. I don't even know exactly what it is, but that's my suspicion. But I do see a correlation there also with the words of the Master. The life of Israel was over. A season had concluded. And a new era really was beginning, and his body was embalmed, was chanated, just as the fig tree has ripened its figs, has chanated its figs, and just as there's going to be a time when these horrible things that are going to happen, they'll happen, and then it will be the beginning of a new era, so to speak, and yes, it'll almost be like a body has died, and yet at the same time, there's going to be a new birth, a new era being born, and indeed the Techiyat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead. So, anyways, that's something that I got, just reading this rarely used Hebrew verb chanat, and then looking at how it's used in Genesis chapter 50 and Song of Songs chapter 2, and then possibly in the original words of our Master in Matthew 24. I hope that's meaningful to your heart. I hope that encourages you. We all go through hard times. We experience tribulation in our lives. During those times, remember the words of the lover in Song of Songs. He says, "You are my darling. You are beautiful. And I want you to come with me. We're going somewhere together. It's a meaningful journey. It's the start of a beautiful season. Winter will indeed end. The rains will eventually stop falling. And let's go enjoy the flowers together." Well, thanks for joining me for this little takeaway. Like I said, this is just one thing from our Hebrew verses lesson, reading through Genesis chapter 50. I would love to have you join our community at holylanguage.com. Our passion is just to read the Bible that Jesus read in the original Hebrew language, grow in our discipleship to him through that act of devotion, and come closer to God along the way. So check us out at holylanguage.com. Consider becoming a member. And either way, shalom to you and be blessed.